July 7th, 1944, 4:30 a.m. The darkness before dawn on Saipan's northern shore held an unnatural silence that made every American Marine along the defensive line instinctively check his rifle. Private First Class Robert Reed of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, crouched in his foxhole near Tanapag, listening to sounds that didn't belong. Shuffling feet, whispered commands in Japanese, the distinctive clink of sack bottles being passed among men preparing to die. What Reed and the 800 other Americans scattered along a 3-mile defensive perimeter couldn't see yet, couldn't fully comprehend, was that approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors and civilians were massing in the pre-dawn darkness for what would become the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. Within 2 hours, the mathematical intersection of fanatical desperation and industrial firepower would transform Tanapag Plain into an abattoir that would haunt survivors on both sides for the rest of their lives. The Battle of Saipan had been raging for 3 weeks. The island, just 1,500 miles from Tokyo, was considered Japanese home territory, administered as part of the empire since 1914. Its loss would bring American B-29 bombers within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. Emperor Hirohito himself had declared that Saipan must be held at all costs. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the 43rd Division, and all Japanese forces on Saipan, understood what the emperor could not accept. The island was already lost. By July 6th, Saito's army had been systematically destroyed. The initial garrison of 30,000 troops had been reduced to perhaps 3,000 effectives through 3 weeks of brutal combat. American firepower, naval gunfire, artillery, tanks, and close air support had methodically crushed every defensive position. The Japanese had been forced into an ever-shrinking pocket on the island's northern tip. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Food was gone. Medical supplies were non-existent. The wounded lay in caves, dying slowly without morphine or bandages. Saito's final command post was a cave near Makunsha village, thick with the stench of gangrene and death. On the evening of July 6th, he assembled his remaining officers for a final conference. Documents captured after the battle revealed his words: "Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death there is life. I will advance with those who remain to deliver still another blow to the American devils and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific." The order issued that night to all Japanese units was succinct. Each man will kill 7 Americans before dying. We will infiltrate the American lines, seize their artillery positions, and drive them back to the beaches. Success will change the outcome of the battle. Failure is not possible because dead men cannot fail. This wasn't military strategy. It was a religious death ritual dressed in tactical language. The Banzai charge, named for the battle cry meaning 10,000 years, represented the ultimate expression of Bushido, the samurai warrior code that had been perverted by militaristic nationalism into a suicide cult. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated since basic training with the concept of gyokusai, honorable death, literally meaning shattered jewel. To be captured was the ultimate shame. To die attacking was the highest honor. What made the upcoming assault unprecedented wasn't just its size, but its composition. Mixed with Saito's remaining infantry were naval troops who had never been trained for ground combat. Sailors from sunken ships, construction workers from the naval base, headquarters clerks who had never fired a rifle in combat, and hundreds of civilians, Korean laborers, and Japanese settlers who had been told that American Marines murdered, raped, and tortured prisoners. These civilians, armed with bamboo spears, sharpened sticks, and sometimes just rocks, had been convinced that suicide attack was preferable to capture. The Americans facing this gathering storm were also a mixed force. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, a National Guard unit from New York, held the center of the defensive line. These were citizen soldiers, not Marines. They'd trained together at armories in the Bronx and Manhattan, neighborhood kids who'd grown up playing stickball together. Their combat experience was limited to Saipan, but 3 weeks of fighting had transformed them from recruits into veterans. Supporting them were elements of the 10th Marine Artillery Regiment with 75 Blazer Sentia and 101st Leopard howitzers positioned in depth behind the front lines. Naval gunfire support was available from destroyers offshore, but the defensive line was dangerously thin. American commanders had stretched their forces to encircle the shrinking Japanese pocket, creating gaps and weak points that would prove catastrophic. Private Reed's foxhole position near Tanapag was part of a section held by just 30 men covering 400 yards of front. Battalion headquarters had promised reinforcements before dawn. They never arrived. At approximately 4:45 a.m., the darkness erupted with sound. Not the expected probing attack or infiltration. A wall of screaming humanity crashed out of the jungle, thousands of voices shrieking Banzai, Tenoheika Banzai, long live the Emperor, mixed with wordless animal howls of men embracing death. Japanese survivors later described the attack's beginning. They had consumed the last reserves of sake and beer. Officers had distributed hand grenades, often just one per man. Soldiers with rifles had been issued their final 5 or 10 rounds. Some carried only bayonets lashed to poles. The walking wounded came, bandages soaked with blood, some supported by comrades. They assembled in rough formation in the darkness and at the signal charged. The front ranks consisted of the remaining combat effectives, soldiers with working rifles and some ammunition. Behind them came the naval troops and headquarters personnel, armed with whatever weapons could be found. Further back came the civilians, a mob of terrified people who had been told they were already dead and might as well die attacking. At the rear, officers with swords, enforcing the charge, cutting down any man who hesitated. Private Reed, peering into the darkness, saw the tree line 100 yards away suddenly vomit forth a mass of running figures. His first thought, captured in a post-battle interview, was that his mind was playing tricks. There were too many of them. It couldn't be real. Then training took over. He began firing his M1 Garand rifle, the semi-automatic weapon that gave American infantry a crucial rate of fire advantage. 8 rounds, aimed center mass at the nearest figures. Watch them fall, reload, fire again. But there were always more. The Japanese charge hit the American line like a tsunami. The mathematics were brutally simple. 30 American soldiers, even with superior weapons, couldn't generate enough firepower to stop 1,000 men charging across 100 yards. The frontline foxholes were overrun in less than 3 minutes. Reed found himself fighting hand-to-hand, using his rifle as a club. A Japanese soldier, unarmed, clawed at his face. Another tried to pull him from the foxhole. He killed them both, then ran. All along the defensive line, the story was the same. Individual positions fought desperately, inflicted horrific casualties, and were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Sergeant Thomas Baker, a squad leader in Company A, organised a fighting withdrawal, stopping every few yards to deliver aimed fire with his Browning automatic rifle. When his position was surrounded, he ordered his men to retreat while he covered them. Baker was found after the battle, dead, surrounded by 8 Japanese corpses. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But even as the front line collapsed, the American response was gathering momentum. The 105th Infantry Regiment's commander, Colonel Leonard Bishop, was in his command post a half-mile behind the lines when the attack began. The sound alone told him everything. This wasn't a raid or infiltration. This was a mass assault. His radioed orders were immediate and stark. All artillery, fire, all available reserves, forward, naval support, maximum effort, hold or die. The American artillery response was devastating and immediate. The 10th Marine Artillery Regiment had pre-registered defensive fires, coordinates for likely Japanese attack routes already calculated and loaded into the fire direction computers. When the call came, gunners began servicing targets with a speed that reflected months of practice. The 105 mm howitzers, positioned 2,000 yards behind the front lines, could fire 4 rounds per minute. Each gun had been supplied with 400 rounds of ammunition, specifically anticipating a Japanese final assault. But artillery, devastating as it was, took minutes to impact. The Japanese charge was seconds away from the artillery positions themselves. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, watched the front line disappear under the human wave and understood that conventional defence was impossible. His order, shouted over the radio and by runner to every unit still intact, reflected desperate pragmatism. Fix bayonets. Stand and fight. If you run, we all die. The 2nd Defensive Line, hastily organised from headquarters personnel, engineers and artillerymen, pressed into infantry service, prepared to meet the charge. These men, many of whom were cooks, clerks and mechanics, found themselves facing a scene from a nightmare. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, many already wounded, some unarmed, running through the darkness directly at their positions. Behind them, more were coming, always more. Private First Class Harold Agerholm, a Navy medical corpsman attached to the 105th Infantry, was stationed at an aid station 300 yards behind the front. When the charge broke through, wounded Americans began streaming back, some running, others crawling. Agerholm refused to evacuate, instead running forward into the chaos to reach wounded men. For the next hour, he made repeated trips into the battle, pulling injured soldiers to safety. On his 6th trip, he was shot through the chest, but continued dragging his patient to the aid station before collapsing. He died minutes later. The Medal of Honor citation noted he had saved at least 15 men. By 5 a.m., just 15 minutes after the attack began, the Japanese charge had penetrated nearly 1,000 yards into American lines. They'd overrun 2 entire companies, captured or destroyed 4 75mm List artillery pieces, and were approaching the main artillery positions. American casualties were mounting rapidly. Entire squads had been wiped out. The battalion commander's prediction was proving accurate. If the position collapsed entirely, the entire northern flank of the American advance would be exposed. But this was the moment when industrial firepower, the accumulated weight of American material superiority, began to assert itself. The howitzer crews, trained to fire at distant targets, found themselves in direct fire combat. Gunners depressed their tubes to minimum elevation, essentially using 150mm howitzers as enormous shotguns. They loaded high explosive shells with proximity fuses, designed to detonate above ground, showering shrapnel across wide areas. Against massed infantry at ranges of 100 yards, the effect was apocalyptic. Corporal Leroy Johnson, a gunner with Battery B, 10th Marines, described firing his howitzer in direct mode. We dropped the tube as low as it would go and started pumping shells straight at them. No calculation, no fire mission. Just load and fire as fast as possible. Each shell killed dozens. I watched one round detonate right in the middle of a group, maybe 30 Japanese soldiers. They just disappeared, vaporized, but more kept, coming. We fired 89 rounds in 15 minutes. The barrel was glowing red. We kept firing. Simultaneously, the naval gunfire support began landing. The destroyer USS Phelps, stationed 2 miles offshore, had been tracking the battle by sound and radio reports. At 5:07 a.m., her 5-inch guns began firing. The forward observer, a Marine lieutenant on the ground with the 105th Infantry, was calling in corrections by radio while fighting off Japanese attackers with his pistol. His calm voice, recorded in the ship's log, guided 40 rounds of naval gunfire into the Japanese rear areas, disrupting follow-on waves and cutting off reinforcements. By 5:30 a.m., dawn was breaking, and the full horror of the battlefield became visible. The Tanapag Plain, a half-mile of relatively open ground, was carpeted with bodies. The Japanese charge, while still moving forward, had lost all cohesion. Small groups of attackers, separated from their units, wandered through the smoke and chaos. Some were still attacking with suicidal determination. Others, the spell broken, seemed dazed, unsure what to do now that they were supposed to be dead but weren't. This was when American infantry firepower, the individual weapons that made the US Army the most lethal force on Earth, began systematically destroying the attack. The M1 Garand rifle, the semi-automatic weapon that General Patton called the greatest implement of battle ever devised, allowed American riflemen to maintain a rate of fire 3 times faster than Japanese soldiers with their bolt-action Arisaka rifles. An American soldier could fire 40 aimed shots per minute. A Japanese soldier, perhaps 15. More devastating were the Browning automatic rifles, the bars, that equipped every rifle squad. These 20-pound monsters, fed by 20-round magazines, could fire 600 rounds per minute. In practiced hands, they were squad-level machine guns. Private Martin May, a bar gunner with Company C, fired 800 rounds that morning, burning through 40 magazines. His position, marked by a pile of spent brass 2 feet high, was credited with stopping at least 60 attackers. The medium machine guns, water-cooled Browning M1917s, were even more lethal. These weapons, firing the same 30-06 round as the Garand but belt-fed and mounted on tripods, could maintain sustained fire indefinitely as long as ammunition and water held out. Sergeant Roy Elrod's machine gun team, positioned near the battalion command post, fired continuously for 90 minutes. Post-battle count showed over 200 Japanese dead in front of their position. But the weapon that truly broke the Banzai charge was the M4 Sherman tank. 7 Shermans from the 762nd Tank Battalion had been held in reserve near the beach. When the front line collapsed, they were ordered forward. Tanks designed for mobile warfare were used as moving fortresses. They advanced slowly into the carnage, their 75 mm main guns firing high, explosive shells at point-blank range, their hull and turret machine guns sweeping the battlefield. Armour that could shrug off Japanese anti-tank weapons made them nearly invulnerable to infantry assault. Private Tadashi Kojo, a Japanese soldier who survived the charge by feigning death, later described the tank's arrival. "We had broken through the first line. We thought we were winning. Then the tanks came. Metal monsters, unstoppable. Our rifles were useless. Men threw grenades that bounced off the armour. Men charged with mines, blown apart before reaching them. The machine guns never stopped firing. You couldn't hide, couldn't fight back, could only run or die. Most died. By 6 a.m. the Japanese attack had effectively ended. Small groups were still fighting, but the organised assault had disintegrated. The battlefield was a scene that defied description. One historian later wrote that it resembled nothing so much as a medieval battlefield, where close-quarters slaughter had piled bodies in heaps. American soldiers, moving cautiously forward to reclaim their positions, found layers of Japanese dead, sometimes stacked 3 or 4 deep where machine gun fire had caught them in the open. The casualty count compiled over the following days revealed the attack's one-sided outcome. Approximately 4,000 Japanese had participated in the charge. At least 3,000 were dead on the battlefield. Another 500 were wounded, most mortally, found dying in the jungle over the following week. Perhaps 500 escaped back into the shrinking Japanese pocket, there to die in subsequent fighting or commit suicide. American casualties were also severe but incomparable. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry suffered 650 casualties, including 98 killed. Every rifle company had lost at least half its strength. But the line had held. The aftermath of the charge revealed details that haunted survivors. Among the Japanese dead were 200 civilians, including women and children, some armed only with bamboo spears. Korean labourers who had been forced to charge alongside Japanese soldiers. Wounded Japanese soldiers, too injured to continue the attack, who had committed suicide with grenades rather than retreat. Officers who had shot themselves after their units were destroyed. American troops found evidence of the desperation that had driven the attack. Japanese soldiers carrying emergency rations that had been consumed days earlier, the packages kept as good luck charms, letters, hastily written before the charge, saying goodbye to families who would never receive them. One letter, translated by American intelligence, read, "Father, I will die tomorrow as a loyal soldier of the Emperor. Please be proud. Tell Mother I am sorry I cannot return. Tell my sister to marry a good man. I will become a cherry blossom and fall beautifully for the nation." The soldier who wrote it was 19 years old. The charge at Tanapag wasn't quite finished. At 6:30 a.m., as American forces were securing their lines, a second wave emerged from the jungle. This was smaller, perhaps. 300 men, but equally desperate. They had been held in reserve, intended to exploit any breakthrough. With the first wave destroyed, they charged anyway. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Artillery, already registered on likely approach routes, began firing within seconds. Machine guns, reloaded and resupplied, opened up at maximum range. The second wave was annihilated before reaching the American lines. Only a handful of attackers survived long enough to close to bayonet range. One of these survivors was a Japanese officer, later identified as Captain Sakai Oba, who would become famous as the last Japanese officer to surrender, holding out in Saipan's mountains until December 1945. Oba participated in the charge but survived by recognizing its futility early and withdrawing with a small group of men. His post-war memoir described the attack. It was not war, it was mass suicide. Officers told us we would break through and reach the beaches. We knew it was impossible, but orders were orders, and death was preferable to dishonour. I watched 1,000 men die in 10 minutes. They achieved nothing except providing target practice for American gunners. I withdrew not from cowardice, but from recognition that death without purpose serves neither the Emperor nor the nation. The largest strategic impact of the Banzai charge was immediate and devastating for Japan. Lieutenant General Saito, who had ordered the attack, committed suicide in his cave headquarters on July 7th, after receiving reports that the assault had failed. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and was now trapped on Saipan, also committed suicide. The Japanese chain of command on Saipan collapsed entirely. For the Americans, the charge's defeat marked a turning point in understanding Japanese tactics. American commanders had encountered Banzai charges before, smaller desperate attacks on Guadalcanal and Tarawa. But Saipan demonstrated conclusively that Japanese infantry tactics, based on spirit and determination rather than firepower and maneuver, were obsolete against American industrial warfare. The lesson would be applied in subsequent battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where American forces built defensive positions specifically designed to channel and destroy Japanese suicide attacks. The political impact in Japan was equally significant. The loss of Saipan, coming so soon after the catastrophic defeat at the Philippine Sea, where the Japanese Navy lost 3 carriers and 600 aircraft, led directly to the fall of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government. Emperor Hirohito, informed of Saipan's loss, reportedly went pale and retired to his chambers for 3 days. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, was shattered. American bombers would soon be striking Tokyo from Saipan's airfields. The human cost extended beyond simple casualty figures. Private Robert Reed, who survived the initial breakthrough and fought his way back to friendly lines, was hospitalized with what would later be diagnosed as combat fatigue, now known as PTSD. His medical records noted, patient experiences severe nightmares, refuses to sleep, becomes violent when startled, states he can still hear the screaming. Reed would spend 6 months in a psychiatric facility before being discharged. He never spoke of Saipan to his family. Corporal Leroy Johnson, the howitzer gunner who fired 89 rounds in direct fire mode, was decorated for his actions but struggled with what he'd witnessed. In a 1982 interview for a military history project, he stated, "People talk about heroism and courage. What I remember is slaughter. We killed them by the hundreds, and they kept coming. It wasn't war, it was butchery. I did my duty, but I'm not proud of it. How can you be proud of killing desperate men who were ordered to die? We won because we had more guns, more shells, more everything. They had courage, and courage wasn't enough. It never is." The Japanese perspective, suppressed during the war by military censorship, emerged in post-war memoirs and interviews. Private Tadashi Kojo, who feigned death and was captured, spent the rest of the war in a POW camp. His account, published in 1952, challenged the official narrative of glorious death. "We were told it was an attack. It was a ritual suicide. Officers who had never faced combat ordered us to charge into machine guns. They stayed behind, safe in their bunkers, while we died. The Americans didn't defeat us. Our own commanders murdered us. They called it Bushido. I call it stupidity. 4,000 men died accomplishing nothing. The Americans barely slowed their advance. We bought them perhaps one day, at the cost of an entire division." The wider pattern of Banzai charges in the Pacific War revealed a fundamental asymmetry between Japanese and American military philosophy. Japanese doctrine, evolved from 19th century warfare and infused with nationalist mythology, emphasized spirit over material. The belief that superior willpower and dedication could overcome inferior numbers or firepower. This had worked against poorly armed Chinese forces in the 1930s. It failed catastrophically against American industrial firepower. American doctrine, by contrast, was explicitly materialistic. Overwhelming firepower applied systematically to destroy enemy forces while minimizing friendly casualties. The US military in World War II operated on the principle that ammunition was cheaper than lives. An American infantry company, attacking a Japanese position, would first call in artillery to pulverize it, then airstrikes to destroy anything that survived, then tank support to suppress remaining resistance. Only then would infantry advance, and even then with heavy fire support. The contrast with Japanese human wave attacks could not have been starker. The numbers illustrated this difference perfectly. American artillery expenditures on Saipan totaled 1.8 million shells. The naval bombardment added another 200,000 rounds. American forces fired an estimated 36 million rounds of small arms ammunition. This was industrial warfare, the application of manufacturing capacity to kill the enemy more efficiently than they could kill you. Against this, Japanese courage and determination were simply insufficient. The morning of July 8th, as American forces restored their defensive lines and prepared to resume the offensive, burial details began the grim task of clearing the battlefield. The concentrated killing ground where the Banzai charge had been stopped required special measures. Graves registration teams, overwhelmed by the number of bodies, requested bulldozers. The dead were pushed into mass graves, Japanese and American separated but barely. The smell of death hung over Tanapag Plain for weeks, despite efforts to sanitize the battlefield. Japanese resistance on Saipan continued for another 2 weeks, but it was the resistance of the doomed. Small unit actions, cave fighting, and finally mass civilian suicides at Marpi Point, where hundreds of Japanese families jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. American victory was inevitable from July 7th onward. The Banzai charge had been Japan's last hope of changing the battle's outcome. Its failure sealed Saipan's fate. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff attempted to learn lessons from Saipan. A classified report captured after the war concluded, "Massed infantry charges against entrenched American positions supported by artillery and armour are ineffective and result in unacceptable casualties with minimal tactical gain. Future defensive operations should emphasise fortified positions, night infiltration, and attrition rather than decisive engagement." This assessment led directly to the defence-in-depth strategies employed at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese forces inflicted maximum American casualties by fighting from prepared positions rather than charging into machine guns. But the cultural imperative remained. Even at Iwo Jima, even at Okinawa, Japanese forces launched final Banzai charges when their positions became untenable. The tradition of Gyokusai, of shattering like a jewel rather than surrendering, persisted until the very end. On Okinawa, in June 1945, the largest final charge of the war saw 1,500 Japanese soldiers wiped out in a single night attack. The pattern established at Saipan repeated until the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion finally forced Japan's surrender. The psychological impact on American forces was profound. After Saipan, American commanders understood that Japanese forces would fight literally to the death, that surrender was culturally impossible for most Japanese soldiers, and that every island would have to be taken by force. This recognition influenced strategic planning for the invasion of Japan itself. American estimates predicted 1 million Allied casualties in Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the home island, specifically because Japanese forces were expected to fight to annihilation rather than surrender. The atomic bombs, whatever their other moral implications, eliminated the need for an invasion that would have replicated Saipan's horrors on an unimaginable scale. The veterans of Saipan, both American and Japanese, carried their experiences for life. Reunion associations formed, both separately and eventually jointly, as former enemies sought to process their shared trauma. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, survivors from both sides gathered on Saipan. Private First Class Robert Reed, now 74 years old, met Tadashi Kojo, the Japanese soldier who had survived by feigning death. Through translators, they discussed the battle. Reed asked why they had charged into certain death. Kojo's response, recorded by a documentary crew, was simple. "We had no choice. Our commanders ordered us to die, and we obeyed. Your commanders gave you weapons and support to live. That was the difference." The Battle of Saipan cost American forces 3,226 killed and 13,099 wounded. Japanese forces lost approximately 24,000 killed in combat, with another 5,000 civilians dead, many by suicide. The disparity reflected not superior American bravery or Japanese cowardice, but the brutal mathematics of industrial firepower against massed infantry. The Banzai Charge of July 7th, the largest single such attack of the Pacific War, demonstrated this disparity in its most extreme form. 4,000 attackers, meeting prepared defences backed by artillery, armour and naval gunfire, had no chance. Their courage was immense, their sacrifice was tragic. But courage without firepower, determination without support, could not overcome the material superiority that America brought to the battlefield. In the end, the Banzai Charge at Saipan stands as a monument to futility, a desperate gamble by commanders who had no other options, sending men to certain death in hope of a miracle that never came. The American defenders, fighting for their lives, had demonstrated that industrial warfare had made traditional notions of combat obsolete. Spirit couldn't stop shells. Courage couldn't deflect bullets. Determination couldn't overcome howitzers firing at point-blank range. The Age of the Samurai, if it had ever truly existed, died on Tanapag Plain alongside 3,000 Japanese soldiers, whose only crime was following orders from commanders who valued honour more than life. The sun rose fully over Saipan on July 7th, 1944, illuminating a field of corpses that stretched for half a mile. The silence that fell after the guns stopped firing was broken only by the cries of the wounded and the prayers of the living. The Banzai charge had broken against American firepower like a wave against a seawall. The Japanese had achieved nothing except their own destruction. The Americans had won a victory that brought them no joy, only grim satisfaction that they had survived. And the war ground on, island by island, toward its inevitable conclusion in atomic fire over Hiroshima. The immediate aftermath of the Banzai charge on July 7th revealed layers of tragedy that simple casualty statistics couldn't capture. As American medics moved through the battlefield treating wounded, they discovered Japanese soldiers who had been injured in the initial assault, unable to advance or retreat, who had taken their own lives rather than face capture. Grenades held to chests, pistol shots to the head. In some cases, wounded men had formed small circles and detonated grenades simultaneously, choosing collective death over individual surrender. Captain Benjamin Salomon, a dentist serving as a surgeon with the 105th Infantry Regiment, was manning an aid station 50 yards behind the front lines when the charge broke through. As wounded Americans streamed back, Salomon continued operating, performing emergency surgery under fire. When Japanese soldiers began infiltrating the aid station area, he ordered the wounded evacuated and manned a machine gun to cover their withdrawal. His body was found after the battle surrounded by 98 dead Japanese soldiers. The machine gun's barrel had been shot away, and Salomon had 76 wounds, including 24 bayonet wounds, many received while he was already dead. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, though the award wasn't officially presented until 2002, delayed by questions about whether medical personnel should receive combat decorations. The command structure of the 105th Infantry Regiment had been shattered. Company A had lost every officer. Company B's commander was dead, along with 2 of his 3 platoon leaders. Company C's captain had been bayoneted while directing artillery fire by radio, continuing to call corrections even as he bled out. The battalion executive officer, Major Edward McCarthy, had taken command of an ad hoc force of clerks and cooks, leading them in a counterattack that retook one of the overrun artillery positions. McCarthy was shot through both legs but refused evacuation until the position was secured. The psychological aftermath was immediate and severe. Combat exhaustion cases spiked dramatically. Men who had fought effectively for 3 weeks suddenly became non-functional, sitting in foxholes staring at nothing, unresponsive to orders or threats. The division psychiatrist, Captain Morris Krugman, later wrote that the Banzai charge produced more acute psychiatric casualties than all previous Saipan combat combined. The sheer intensity of close-quarters fighting, the sight of thousands of attackers willing to die, and the intimate nature of the killing, much of it at bayonet range or with rifle butts and entrenching tools, overwhelmed men's psychological defences. Private George Mullins, a replacement who had arrived on Saipan just days before the charge, was found the morning of July 8th sitting beside his foxhole, methodically field-stripping his rifle and reassembling it over and over. When approached, he continued the motion mechanically, eyes unfocused. He was evacuated to the hospital ship where doctors noted he had killed at least 15 Japanese soldiers at ranges of less than 10 feet. His hands continued making the motions of loading and firing his rifle for 3 days before he could speak. He never returned to combat duty. The Japanese survivors, the few hundred who had escaped back into the shrinking defensive pocket, were in even worse psychological condition. They had been ordered to die gloriously and had failed even at that. In Japanese military culture, this failure was worse than death itself. Several survivors were reportedly executed by their own officers for cowardice, for retreating when ordered to advance until dead. Others committed suicide not from wounds but from shame. One Japanese sergeant, found wounded and captured on July 9th, told interrogators through tears that he had tried to die but couldn't. He'd charged the American lines 4 separate times, been shot twice, and survived. He'd tried to detonate a grenade, but it was a dud. He'd tried to shoot himself, but had no ammunition left. Finally, too weak from blood loss to continue, he'd hidden in a shell crater, until American troops found him. His last words before being taken to the POW camp were a repeated apology to the Emperor for his failure to die properly. The logistical aftermath of the charge was almost as challenging as the combat itself. American supply units had to rapidly replenish ammunition stocks that had been depleted at catastrophic rates. The 10th Marine Artillery Regiment alone had fired more shells in 6 hours than in the previous 3 days combined. Small arms ammunition expenditure had been so intense that some units were down to less than 100 rounds per man by dawn, a dangerously low reserve. Emergency supply convoys ran all night on July 7th, bringing ammunition forward from beach dumps. The 762nd Tank Battalion's Shermans, which had been instrumental in stopping the charge, required immediate maintenance. The tanks had fired their main guns so rapidly that several had cracked breech blocks. Machine gun barrels were worn smooth from sustained fire and had to be replaced. One tank had been hit by 14 separate anti-tank grenades, none penetrating but all causing external damage that needed repair. The tank crews, who had fought from inside sealed steel boxes in tropical heat while surrounded by attackers trying to pry open hatches, were almost as psychologically damaged as the infantry. Sergeant Mike Strank of the 762nd, commanding one of the Shermans that had advanced into the kill zone, described the experience decades later. Inside the tank you couldn't see much, just small vision slits, but you could hear everything. Bullets hitting the armour like hail, grenades exploding, men screaming. The Japanese were climbing on the tank, trying to force open the hatches, stuffing explosives into the treads. We kept the machine guns firing, traversing the turret back and forth. The bow gunner was shooting blind, just spraying fire wherever the hull pointed. When we finally stopped and opened the hatches, the tank was covered in blood. Not ours, theirs. The treads were jammed with body parts. We had to hose down the entire vehicle before we could move again. The battlefield clearing operation took 5 full days. American engineers with bulldozers carved mass graves into the coral bedrock. Japanese dead were buried in separate plots, their personal effects collected for later identification if possible. Dog tags and identification papers were sent to intelligence for analysis. The sheer number of bodies created sanitation concerns in the tropical heat. By July 9th, the smell of decomposition was so overwhelming that men working on burial details wore gas masks not for protection from chemical weapons, but to filter the stench of death. Among the Japanese dead, American troops found evidence that challenged their understanding of their enemy. Personal diaries revealed not fanatical warriors eager for death, but frightened young men following orders they knew were suicidal. One diary, belonging to a 20-year-old private from Hokkaido, contained entries from the days before the charge. July 5th. We have been ordered to attack tomorrow. Everyone knows we will die. July 6th. I do not want to die. I want to see my mother again, but orders are orders and a soldier's duty is to obey. I will try to be brave. The final entry, written in the hours before the charge, I am very afraid. Please forgive me for being a coward. I will charge tomorrow and try to die well for the Emperor. Please tell my family I was brave, even if I was not. The American dead received individual burials in the division cemetery established near Charankanoa. Graves registration teams worked to identify every body, tagging them with metal markers and recording the location for eventual return to the United States. The ceremony held on July 10th for the 105th Infantry's fallen was brief but deeply felt. The regimental chaplain, Captain John O'Brien, who had fought alongside infantrymen during the charge, read from the 23rd Psalm and reminded the assembled troops that their comrades had died so that others might live, the highest form of sacrifice. Colonel Leonard Bishop, the 105th's commander, addressed his decimated regiment. You have faced the worst that war can offer, and you did not break. You stood against thousands and you held. Some of our brothers fell, but they fell facing the enemy, fighting to the last. We will remember them not as victims, but as warriors who gave everything for their country and their fellow soldiers. The island is not yet secured, and we will continue fighting. But you have already proven that American soldiers will not yield, cannot be broken, and will always stand together against any threat. The strategic situation on Saipan was now reaching its final phase. The Japanese defensive pocket had been compressed into approximately 2 square miles at the northern tip of the island. With the failure of the Banzai charge, organized Japanese resistance essentially ceased. What remained was a slow, methodical clearing operation, cave by cave, bunker by bunker. American forces, now reinforced and with overwhelming material superiority, began the grim task of destroying the last Japanese positions. The Japanese response to their failure revealed the depth of their desperation. Unable to mount another organized attack and unwilling to surrender, many Japanese soldiers simply waited in caves to be killed. Others conducted individual or small group suicide attacks, charging from hiding with grenades or bayonets, achieving nothing except their own deaths. The most horrifying response came from the civilian population trapped in the pocket. Japanese propaganda had told civilians that American soldiers were barbaric savages who would torture, rape, and murder prisoners. This propaganda, combined with a military code that considered surrender the ultimate shame, led to mass civilian suicides that shocked American troops. At Marpi Point, the northernmost tip of Saipan, hundreds of Japanese civilians, families with children, elderly couples, young mothers with infants, threw themselves from 100-foot cliffs onto the rocks below, rather than face capture. American troops watching through binoculars were horrified. Marines set up loudspeakers, pleading in Japanese for civilians to surrender, promising safety and medical care. Navy ships offshore sent messages by signal light. Japanese-American interpreters risked their lives climbing the cliffs to talk to terrified civilians. Some were saved, pulled back from the edge at the last moment. But hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, jumped to their deaths. Parents threw their children off first, then followed. The scenes traumatized American troops who had become hardened to combat death, but couldn't process the sight of mothers killing their own babies. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, a Mexican-American Marine who spoke Japanese and had been capturing enemy soldiers through persuasion rather than force, managed to talk 800 civilians and soldiers into surrendering over the course of the Saipan campaign. On July 10th, he approached a cave where civilians were preparing for mass suicide. Through patient negotiation, showing photographs of other prisoners being treated well, he convinced them to surrender. As they emerged from the cave, an American officer, assuming they were attacking, nearly ordered his men to fire. Gabaldon threw himself in front of the civilians, shouting that they were surrendering. The officer held fire and 73 lives were saved. Gabaldon received the Navy Cross for his actions throughout the campaign, but for every civilian saved, others died. The waters around Marpi Point were thick with floating bodies for days. Navy personnel tasked with recovering the dead found entire families still clinging together. The psychological impact on American troops was profound. Many had never questioned the righteousness of their cause, but watching children die because of Japanese propaganda created an anger that transcended the normal battlefield hatred. It wasn't anger at the civilians themselves, but at the Japanese military system that had so thoroughly indoctrinated people that death seemed preferable to American compassion. The final organized Japanese resistance ended on July 9th, when the command cave system near Makunsha was finally overrun. American troops, using flamethrowers and explosives, systematically cleared the complex. Inside, they found the bodies of Lieutenant General Saito and Vice Admiral Nagumo, both dead by suicide. Saito had shot himself after dictating a final message to his troops. Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had shot himself after burning his personal papers and Emperor's portrait to prevent capture. Also found were dozens of wounded Japanese soldiers, too injured to participate in the Banzai charge or flee, who had been left to die in the caves. Some had been dead for days. Others were barely alive, lying in their own waste without food, water, or medical care. American medics, following the rules of war, treated enemy wounded the same as their own. Many Japanese soldiers, expecting execution, were stunned to receive plasma, morphine, and surgery. Some refused treatment initially, had to be held down while medics saved their lives, convinced it was some form of torture. Private Kiyoshi Murata, a Japanese soldier captured wounded on July 10th, later recounted his experience. I had been shot in the stomach during the charge and crawled back to the caves to die. For 3 days I lay in darkness, no food, no water, waiting for death. When the Americans came, I tried to detonate a grenade but was too weak. They grabbed me, and I waited for the bayonet. Instead, they gave me water. Then they carried me to their hospital and operated on me. I did not understand. We had been told Americans were demons who killed prisoners. Instead, they saved my life. It was then I began to question everything my officers had told me. The organised battle for Saipan was declared over on July 9th, though mopping up operations continued for weeks. The final statistics were sobering. American casualties totaled 16,125, including 3,126 killed. Japanese military casualties were approximately 24,000 killed, with fewer than 1,000 captured, the lowest surrender rate of any Pacific battle to that point. Civilian casualties exceeded 22,000, the majority suicides. The island, covering just 45 square miles, had consumed more than 60,000 lives in 24 days of combat. The impact of the Banzai charge specifically was analysed extensively by American military intelligence. A detailed report compiled in August 1944 attempted to understand Japanese tactical thinking. The report concluded that the charge had been militarily pointless, achieving no tactical objectives and wasting the last effective combat power available to Japanese forces. However, the report noted that from a cultural perspective, the charge made perfect sense. Japanese military culture, the report stated, valued death over surrender so completely that a suicidal attack was preferable to passive defeat. This understanding influenced American planning for subsequent operations. At Peleliu, in September 1944, Japanese forces under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa largely abandoned Banzai charges in favour of defence in depth, inflicting far higher American casualties. At Iwo Jima, in February 1945, General Tadamichi Kurabayashi explicitly forbade Banzai charges, ordering his troops to fight from prepared positions and make every American advance as costly as possible. The change in tactics was directly attributed to lessons learned from Saipan's failure, but cultural imperatives remained strong. Even Kurabayashi's carefully planned defence ended with a Banzai charge on the final night of organised resistance. Even Nakagawa's defence-in-depth strategy concluded with a suicidal final attack. The pattern established at Saipan, the inability to simply surrender when defeat was certain, repeated throughout the Pacific War. Japanese forces would fight to the last, launch final charges when positions became untenable, and choose death over capture. American forces learned to anticipate and plan for this, creating defensive positions specifically designed to channel and destroy suicide attacks. The psychological legacy of the Banzai charge affected both sides for decades. American veterans, interviewed years later, consistently described it as the most terrifying experience of their military service, worse than any other combat they'd experienced. The sight of thousands of men charging into certain death, the close-quarters killing, and the sheer intensity of the combat created trauma that many never fully processed. Japanese veterans faced different psychological challenges. Survivors of failed Banzai charges carried guilt for outliving their comrades, shame for not dying as ordered, and anger at officers who had wasted their lives pointlessly. Many struggled with the disconnect between the glorious death they'd been promised and the meaningless slaughter they'd experienced. Post-war Japanese society, trying to move beyond militarism, offered little space for veterans to process these experiences. The families of the dead on both sides received standardized notifications. American families received Western Union telegrams. The Secretary of War regrets to inform you that your son was killed in action on Saipan. Japanese families received notices from local military authorities. Your son died gloriously in service to the Emperor, bringing honour to your family. Both were inadequate to convey the reality of what had happened, the industrial-scale killing that had claimed their loved ones. In the immediate aftermath of Saipan, the strategic implications became clear. American forces now possessed an unsinkable aircraft carrier 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Within months, B-29 Superfortress bombers began arriving on Saipan, using the airfields that CB construction battalions carved from coral bedrock. By November 1944, B-29s flying from Saipan began the strategic bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands. The loss of Saipan led directly to the firebombing of Japanese cities, and ultimately to the atomic bombs dropped from Tinian, Saipan's neighbouring island. The Japanese government's response to Saipan's loss was political upheaval. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into war, was forced to resign on July 18th, less than 2 weeks after the Banzai charge. His replacement, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited an impossible situation. The loss of Saipan meant American bombers could reach Japan. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation at the Philippine Sea meant the Navy couldn't defend the homeland. The revelation that Banzai charges were suicide rather than effective tactics meant the army's doctrine was bankrupt, but no Japanese leader could publicly admit defeat. The war continued for another year, consuming hundreds of thousands more lives on both sides. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Philippines, Burma, each battle replicated Saipan's pattern. Japanese forces fighting to the death, American forces using overwhelming firepower to systematically destroy them. The ending was never in doubt after Saipan. Only the cost remained to be calculated. For the individual soldiers involved in the Banzai charge, the experience became the defining moment of their lives, for better or worse. Many American veterans never spoke of it. The memory's too painful to share. Some channeled their experiences into advocacy for veterans' mental health, recognizing that psychological wounds could be as debilitating as physical ones. Others struggled with alcohol, broken marriages, and suicide, the delayed casualties of combat trauma in an era that didn't acknowledge PTSD. Japanese veterans who survived the war faced different challenges. Many concealed their military service, the shame of defeat combining with post-war Japanese pacifism to make veterans unwelcome reminders of a discredited past. Some formed veterans associations, small groups of survivors who could discuss their experiences without judgment. Others travelled to Saipan decades later, performing Buddhist ceremonies for the dead, seeking closure that never fully came. The battlefield itself became a memorial. The Tanapag Plain, where the charge occurred, was initially left largely undisturbed. Local Chamorros, the native people of Saipan who had survived Japanese occupation and American liberation, understood the ground was sacred, soaked in blood from thousands of dead. As Saipan developed economically in the post-war decades, the battlefield was gradually built over, but memorials were erected to mark where the killing had occurred. In 1994, the 50th anniversary of the battle brought together veterans from both sides for the first time. The meetings were awkward initially, former enemies meeting as old men, but shared trauma created unexpected bonds. Robert Reed, the American private who had fought in the first wave, met Tadashi Kojo, the Japanese soldier who had survived by feigning death. Through translators, they discussed their experiences. Both men wept. Both men hugged. Neither man felt victory or defeat anymore, only survival and sadness for those who hadn't survived. The lessons of the Banzai charge resonated through military history. Tactical analysts studying the battle emphasized the futility of infantry charges against prepared defenses with modern firepower. The charge became a case study in what not to do, an example of how courage without adequate support simply resulted in massacre. Military historians use Saipan to illustrate the broader transformation of warfare in the 20th century, how industrial capacity had become more important than warrior spirit. But the deeper lesson was about the cost of fanaticism. The Japanese military's insistence on death before surrender, its elevation of suicide to moral virtue, its willingness to waste lives pointlessly rather than admit defeat. These cultural factors made the Pacific War far bloodier than it needed to be. Had Japanese forces been willing to surrender when defeat was certain, tens of thousands of lives on both sides would have been saved. But such surrender was culturally impossible, and so the killing continued until only atomic weapons could shock Japan into capitulation. The American response, the overwhelming application of firepower to destroy enemy forces while minimizing friendly casualties, represented a different philosophy. Critics called it brutal, the willingness to incinerate enemies with flamethrowers, artillery, and eventually atomic bombs rather than accept higher American casualties. Defenders called it pragmatic, the recognition that in total war, the side that preserved its own strength while destroying the enemies would ultimately prevail. The Banzai charge at Saipan perfectly illustrated this asymmetry. Japanese forces spent 4,000 lives to achieve nothing. American forces, using firepower rather than flesh, stopped them while suffering comparatively minimal casualties. In the decades since World War II, military technology has evolved beyond anything imagined in 1944. Precision-guided munitions, drone strikes, and cyber warfare have made the kind of mass infantry combat seen at Saipan largely obsolete. But the fundamental question raised by the Banzai charge remains relevant. How much is victory worth? What price in lives is acceptable to achieve military objectives? When does determination become fanaticism? When does pragmatism become callousness? The men who fought at Saipan, both American and Japanese, didn't have the luxury of philosophical debate. They fought because they were ordered to fight, killed because refusing to kill meant dying, and survived through a combination of skill, luck, and the support of the systems behind them. The American soldiers survived largely because their military provided overwhelming firepower, logistical support, and medical care. The Japanese soldiers died largely because their military provided none of these, only orders to die gloriously for an emperor who would surrender anyway just 1 year later. The morning of July 7th, 1944, when 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged into American guns on Saipan, marked both the high watermark and the death knell of Japanese military fanaticism in World War II. The courage of the attackers was unquestionable. The futility of their sacrifice was undeniable. They had been sent to die by commanders who had no other options, no strategy beyond throwing bodies at enemy positions and hoping for a miracle. The miracle never came. The Americans didn't break. The line held, and by dawn the Tanapag Plain was carpeted with the bodies of men whose courage had been wasted by commanders who valued honor more than life. In the final analysis, the Banzai charge at Saipan demonstrated that modern warfare had fundamentally changed. Industrial firepower, properly applied, could defeat any amount of courage or determination. The age where spirit could overcome material disadvantage had ended. The age of industrial warfare, where the side with more factories, more resources, and more efficient killing machines would inevitably prevail, had fully arrived. The Japanese learned this lesson at terrible cost. The Americans learned it too, though their casualties were far lighter. And the world learned that the next war, if it came, would be decided not by the bravery of soldiers charging into fire, but by the power of weapons that could annihilate cities in an instant. The Banzai charge died at Saipan, but its memory lived on, a testament to both human courage and human folly, to the warriors who obeyed orders unto death and to the commanders who gave those orders knowing they were sending men to meaningless slaughter. Neither side won glory that morning. Both sides lost far too much, and the killing continued for another year until finally, mercifully, the war ended, and the survivors could begin the long process of trying to forget what they could never forget, and live with memories that would haunt them until their last breath.